On October 7, 2007, Pope Benedict XVI restored the Latin Mass, parts of which date back to apostolic times. This Mass was celebrated in Roman catacombs 2,000 years ago, which is why Pope Benedict XVI said, "What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and cannot be forbidden or even considered harmful." This bishop agrees, and in his diocese, the Latin Mass stays. But why is Pope Francis trying to cancel the Latin Mass? Tonight, in this special edition of the Remnant Underground. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Michael Madden. Welcome to this special edition of the Remnant Underground. We're just having a little debate here as cameras rolled about the difference between doing commentary on what we believe is the common good for the church or for the world versus what we're trying to get to have happen for ourselves in our own personal lives. Is this what you're saying? That we need to be more clear about that?
I think you should. I think you're pretty.
Yeah, because I mean, I'll come out here and complain about what's happening in the Catholic Church, for example, but my personal situation with my priest and my family is fantastic. So I'm not looking for a change. I'm not looking for any suggestions to join the Orthodox or join the Pius X, whatever else. What we're talking about is the overall problem in the church or a problem in the world. So, for example, people say, well, none of this matters. You could just join the Society of St. Pius X, for example. But this misses the point. It really loses the plot of what Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX has been doing from the start, right? They're not just looking for their own little mass. So if you think about Summorum Pontificum, for example, which was when Pope Benedict XVI restored the traditional Latin Mass, he was basically answering Archbishop Lefebvre's requests, his conditions, the Society of Pius X's conditions as they had evolved since 1988. You got to restore the Mass to the entire Catholic Church. Remember, you got to lift the excommunications of the bishops and so forth. So when they say they wanted the traditional Latin Mass restored to the entire church, they're talking about for the good of the church. So it's rare that you have, like on this program, just concerns about what's going to affect me personally. And so if the Society of St. Pius X, Archbishop Lefebvre, was trying to get the traditional Latin Mass restored for the good of the church, we have to have a similar outlook, I think is what this discussion was all about, in terms of what we're going to talk about tonight. Like, what do we do with bishops who are absolutely intolerant of the Latin Mass? They're shutting it all down, no questions asked. Or what do we do with a bishop tonight, a Novus Ordo bishop, who's not a traditionalist, he's not a remnant guy, he's not Archbishop Vigano, but he did something really, really admirable. And I think it's really important to talk about that, to think about that, encouraging and hoping other bishops to do the same. So we're going to show you some video here in a moment of dozens and dozens of little children at the Latin Mass. They're not my kids. I'm fine. My children are fine. But those children, we have to think about those children, the future of their traditional Latin Mass communities, the future of their communities, period, and what's going to best benefit them. And it's not just going to be a little cookie cutter solution. Go to my parking lot. There's no salvation outside of my parking lot. Just come here and everything will be fine. That's not the point. This whole program is all about trying to do the best we can for the common good throughout the whole world, throughout the whole church. I think, does that clarify?
That was great.
Kind of clarifies?
Exactly.
So let's move into finally the topic of tonight's show, which is some really good news now. With rumors that Pope Francis is about to lower the boom on the traditional Latin Mass, and for those of you who are not Catholic, I'm going to explain what this all means, and I think in some detail that will be something you might find interesting. In the middle of all this, the Bishop of Duluth, Minnesota, Bishop Daniel J. Felton, suddenly went to bat this past weekend for traditional Catholics in his diocese. The Latin Mass, says Bishop Felton, is going to stay.
With this response from the Holy See, and after much prayer and consultation with our priest, our presbyteral council, and especially with Father Hastings, and with the priests who publicly celebrate Mass using the Missale Romana of 1962, I have decided that the celebration of the Mass using the Missale Romana of 1962 will take place in our diocese exclusively at St. Benedict Church here in Duluth. To that end, I have received a dispensation from the Vatican, from Article 3.2, to have this Mass be celebrated in a parish church.
I was standing back there, drove over 2 hours up to Lake Superior when I heard that this was going to happen. I'm sort of anticipating that it's going to be, more bad news. We're going to stick you in a gymnasium. We're going to shut you down. Too bad, so sad, go to hell. I was kind of thinking that. And I'm standing there with my iPhone in the back of the church watching this happen, and I was moved by a pastoral sensitivity and a charity. I'm not claiming that Bishop Felton would agree with me on a lot of things, but this is a good man. I'll take a little bit more of what he said. It was quite amazing.
St. Benedict Church has been and continues to be the home of the vast majority of Catholics in northeastern Minnesota who deeply appreciate this form of the Mass. I am fully in support of those who worship at St. Benedict Church using this form, and I wish to state clearly that this community of the faithful is a rich blessing in our diocese.
The Latin Mass is a rich blessing in our diocese. Did you hear that? And again, His Excellency's sincerity there was palpable. The first thing he said is, I wanted to come and be with you today so I could personally deliver this good news. And I was thinking, they're in a bind now. Good bishops are in a bind over Traditionis Custodes. Pope Francis has put them in a bind too. They didn't ask for any of this. Many of them do indeed support their Latin Mass communities. I know because I published the findings of the dubia that was sent from Pope Francis to all the bishops of the world, asking them, what do you think of the Latin Mass? We got a hold of that through Vatican journalist Diane Montagna. We published it, put a little bit up on the screen. This is 2001. And what we discovered was that most bishops, in fact, told Francis that they support the traditional Latin Mass communities in their diocese. In other words, there is no problem to fix. So why are we fixing? The old adage, don't fix it if it ain't broke. What exactly is broken here? And when you can't come up with what it is that's broken, you begin to feel like this is malicious, like it's personal. This young woman you see on your screen who I talked to in Duluth on Sunday. I'll just let that roll a little bit as we describe. This is traditional Catholicism. A young mom opened to life. She's just trying to raise her babies with the Latin Mass that she loves, probably that she grew up with, right? Now, does she look like a threat to unity to you? Do you think she's sitting there telling that little baby all about the evils and the horrors of Vatican II? She wrote with the Vatican II is terrible. What are we talking about? In the real world, what we're talking about is this young woman and tens of thousands just like her all over the world. And last Sunday, Bishop Daniel Felton of Duluth, Minnesota, publicly said, no, this young woman is not a threat. In fact, I stand with her.
I am fully in support of those who worship at St. Benedict Church using this form, and I wish to state clearly that this community of the faithful is a rich blessing in our diocese.
Wouldn't it be great if all bishops spoke like that to us? Don't you think we could have actual dialogue, maybe, and come to something of a consensus, rather than being blown apart, being polarized by what's coming out of, that's coming out of the Vatican right now? And I repeat, Bishop Felton is not a traditionalist. You know what he is? He's a shepherd who has a heart. He's a shepherd who has the faith. And it manifests itself in his charitable and fraternal and pastoral concern for his flock. So on January 22nd, 2023, at the Church of St. Benedict in Duluth, Minnesota, for the public record, Bishop Felton set an important precedent that, in my opinion, every sincere bishop in the world needs to consider. Essentially, it's do the right thing. Be the good shepherd. Now, for those of you who are not Catholic, what are we talking about? What's going on here? I don't get it. What we're talking about is something called Traditionis Custodes, which is a motu proprio of Pope Francis. It's Pope Francis's program to phase out gradually in stages the traditional Latin Mass, and to, by extension or de facto, excommunicate all those traditional Catholics who love the traditional Catholic liturgy. It's the only Mass that they know. Their children only know that Mass, and they want to stay with that. So if you want to stay with it, we're getting to the point now where you're going to have to leave the church to find it, you see? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Parts of this Mass, it's in Greek and it's in Latin, and some of these prayers date all the way back to the days of our Lord and his disciples when they walked this earth. It goes back to the Roman catacombs, where the first Latin Masses were offered 2,000 years ago on the tombs of the martyrs. In other words, it's a pretty cool thing. It goes all the way back 2,000 years. And if you're a Catholic and you love your faith and you realize this is the Mass that Joan of Arc attended, this is where Thomas Aquinas worshipped, this is the only Mass St. Thomas More ever knew, this is the Mass Charlemagne would have gone to, there's any number of reasons to say, I want to learn more about this treasure, which is what Pope Benedict XVI called it when he restored it to the mainstream church. It's a treasure, a rich treasure of immense value now and all the way down through time, you see? And so the traditional Catholics are just saying, man, this is me, this is part of me, this is in my heart, it's in my soul, it's part of who I am as a Catholic. I want to know more about this Mass. It feeds us on some level that's very deep and very profound, spiritually. So that's what we're talking about, friends. And I'm sorry, but the crisis in the church is such that for whatever reason, there's a concerted effort from the top all the way down to get rid of that, to restrict access, to ban access to the only Mass that St. Padre Pio ever said as a priest. You see? And why is this? Why is this a problem? Why is this Mass a problem? That's a good question. Why is it a problem? That's what we're all trying to find out. What is it? Why is this a problem? Does it have something to do with the globalist experiment where you can't have all these traditional Catholics united, globally, internationally, liturgically through a liturgy with the same language and the same customs and the same, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out. I think I do know, but for the purposes of this show, we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to try to get everybody in this audience to ask the question, what's actually going on here? Why are they doing this in the Catholic Church? It's happening. And I'm not going to give you the answer. I mean, you can just listen to the evidence and you decide what's really going on here. Because that mother now that we just showed you, put her up on the screen again, the mother with the little baby, she loves that Mass. So what? Why can't she attend that Mass? She wants her children to experience that Mass. So what? Why can't they? If they were Arapaho or Sioux Indian children, they wanted to experience their own culture, we would applaud that, right? Get to know it, dress up like they did in the past, go through those rituals, study them to see what they mean, right? So why does this mom with her kids, why can't she learn about the rituals and the prayers of her heritage as a Catholic? You see, this doesn't make any sense, especially now when the Vatican and everybody are positively fixated on ethnic groups and indigenous peoples and their liturgies. But not if it's the Latin Mass. No, that's dangerous. And this has many, many problems. And one of the main reasons, by the way, that Pope John Paul, now this is important, Pope John Paul in 1988 partially restored access to the traditional Latin Mass. And again, it had everything to do with what Archbishop Lefebvre was doing. I don't have time to get into all the details. But for the purpose of this discussion right now, Pope John Paul, and then later Pope Benedict XVI, they restored access to the traditional Latin Mass of Christendom, so that people like that mother that we just showed you with her baby, people like me, we didn't have to sort of leave the mainstream and go seek out that Latin Mass in chapels, which they say have irregular canonical status. You see? You could argue that was a pastoral thing. They wanted to make sure people stayed firmly in the church, and so they brought the Latin Mass back in so that they would be satisfied spiritually in the bosom of the church and wouldn't feel the need to wander off, right? So whether you and I think that the Society of St. Pius X is actually in schism is beside the point, because we know they pray for the Pope, they pray for the Bishop. If they are in schism, it's an extremely irregular schism, but that's beside the point. The point is, Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI granted access to the Latin Mass, restored the Latin Mass, so that people like the mother that we just saw wouldn't have to go elsewhere. And Pope Benedict XVI's own longtime secretary, Archbishop Georg Ganschwein, just a couple weeks ago, confirmed this. Here's what he said.
Das hat er als Emeritus noch erlebt, als das Motu Proprio Traditionis Custodes von Franziskus erschien. Hat ihn das enttäuscht?
Das war schon ein Einschnitt. Ich glaube, dass Papst Benedikt also dieses Motu Proprio gelesen hat mit Schmerz im Herzen, weil er wollte ja gerade denen helfen, sozusagen den inneren Frieden zu finden, auch den liturgischen Frieden, um sie von Lefebvre wegzuziehen, ne, die eben in der alten Messe einfach eine Heimat gefunden haben. Und ich meine,
now, this is where you got to think outside the little traditionalist box for a second. You can get very upset by that. Oh man, after all the terrible bishops, the McCarricks and everybody else, that we could be exposed to, he mentions Lefebvre. Or we can look at this and say, what's Ganschwein getting at? Why did he mention Lefebvre? You know why I think so? He did this, if you read between the lines, I think Ganschwein is actually saying, wait guys, Francis evidently doesn't care if people leave the mainstream church. And maybe he's even driving people to that. He doesn't care if you leave in search of, the Mass at some canonically irregular chapel. And Ganschwein is saying, well, that's a problem. And why doesn't Francis care? When his predecessors cared a great deal. They really cared to try to protect the integrity of the church and make sure a schism doesn't widen the church. You see? So he says, Francis comes out and says, well, he would say, I would imagine, well, I know, but the more important problem here is divisiveness. We must be unified. We can't have anything that sort of breaks down unity. Latin Mass is just unifying. But is it? How can the Mass of 2,000 years of Christendom, of history of the church, be disunifying? The Catholic Church, by the way, is composed of 23 distinct rites. At the moment, there are some 16 million Eastern Rite Catholics in the church. Are they divisive? Anybody writing motu proprios to shut them down? Is the Ambrosian Rite divisive? I was in Milan just last summer in Italy. I attended the Ambrosian Rite Mass. Here's what it looks like. Let me tell you, preface this by saying it looks a lot like the traditional Latin Mass and nothing like the Novus Ordo Mass. Now, why isn't anybody talking about getting rid of that one? Is it divisive? What about the Mozarabic Rite, the Byzantine liturgy, the Alexandrian, the Antiochian, the Chaldean, the Armenian? On and on it goes. Throughout the 1980s, I attended the Ukrainian Rite. And guess what? I now love the Latin Mass and the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom with all my heart. Both of them. I got to know both of them, thanks be to God. Attending the Ukrainian Rite, where they speak in Ukrainian, and I don't have much Ukrainian, believe me. You know what happened? It unified us. It unified my family and friends with my Ukrainian Catholic brothers and sisters. You see? And this is to say nothing now, if you want to talk about unity, this is to say nothing of the truly bizarre variations of the Novus Ordo mainstream Mass that most Catholics can't even recognize.
We begin to the north. It is the direction of the cool winter snows and ice.
So that's okay. But the Mass of Padre Pio, the Mass that he celebrated every day of his priestly life when I was a kid, not in the Middle Ages, but even up into the early 1970s, that Mass is divisive. That Mass has to go. Catholic or not, you got to ask yourself, what's going on here? Why do we feel like we're not being given the truth at all? Why do we feel like there's a malicious attempt to undermine not us, but the entire liturgical patrimony of the Roman Catholic Church here? What's going on? I would ask bishops of the world, in all sincerity, Your Excellencies, what's really going on here? Why is the Vatican canceling the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass of John Paul the Great's ordination, for example. Why is this happening? The Mass that Father Colby would have said every day. Right? Really? What's going on? Because something's wrong, right? And that's why some very good priests are looking at this situation and they're saying, it's more than just wrong. It's more than just confusing. It's evil.
Traditionis Custodes is the most evil document that has ever been produced in the name of the Church.
Well, people recoil in horror at that. Oh, that's a shocking thing. Is it? Is that shocking? Father Maudsley didn't start this fire. He's just minding his own business. And all of a sudden, Rome cracks down on him and all of the other priests of the world who are trying to fulfill their vocation according to the traditional Latin rite.
Now, all of you no doubt would have heard about the decree released by Archbishop Costello on Monday, and also would know about all the heartache and distress it has caused all of us here at St Anne's. Now, it's vital for the future of the Latin Mass in St Anne's that anyone who has been harmed by this decree assume their canonical right to petition Archbishop Costello. This recourse is our chance to tell him who we are, what we are about, and how we cherish the Latin Mass, the sacraments, and our community life here at St Anne's. Up to this point, I've battled for the past 4 years, doing as much as I can to protect St Anne's. But now I need you to step up and do your part. I can't do any more. I've done everything I could. Otherwise, there is the chance that we will lose everything that we've worked so hard for the past 10 years since we came here in 2010.
Well, why are they doing this? Pope Francis, by the way, this is an important distinction for those of you who are not traditionalists, liturgical traditionalists, or not even Catholic. He's not targeting renegades who've left the church. It's not who he's talking about. Francis is targeting diocesan priests, priests who are in the diocesan structure and who are saying the traditional Latin Mass according to what was allowed in Summorum Pontificum by Pope Benedict XVI. Many of them just have learned to say it in the last 10 years. Diocesan priests. Most of them are saying both the new Mass and the traditional Latin Mass for their parishes, for their communities. So now Traditionis Custodes is also turning diocesan bishops into bad guys because they're the ones that got to go shut these Novus Ordo priests down who are saying the Latin Mass. Well, they don't want to do that. Things are working out pretty well. There's scandal all through the diocese. Churches are closing everywhere. And then there's this bright spot. Churches teeming with young families, full wall-to-wall, standing only traditional Latin Masses. The bishops aren't eager. Many of the bishops aren't eager to shut that down. Most bishops don't want to cancel thriving communities in their diocese. It just isn't done. Again, like the one you see on your screen right now, they don't want to cancel those. But they're being ordered to by the Vatican. And I'm back to the question I'll probably ask 500 times tonight, because I'm trying to provoke everyone to ask the same question. Why? Why? In the middle of everything that's going on, from COVID to mass apostasy in the church, to wars, to kids so confused and messed up and changing their sex and getting drugged up and pierced, everything going wrong. Why would anyone want to shut down little communities where folks are going faithfully to Mass every Sunday, confession every Saturday, raising their kids happy in the faith? Why? And you'll have to forgive those of us who look at it and say, there's something demonic about that right now. Leave them alone. You get predator priests all over the place, that whole scandal there. Folks don't even trust the priests, many priests anymore. Unfairly, I think, the mainstream media stamps that's the stamp of pedophile over the entire Catholic priest. You got all these problems that Catholics have to try to somehow muddle through and keep the faith. And then they find this little oasis where there's a traditional Latin Mass going on in a thriving community. And the Vatican, Pope Francis, wants to shut them down. Especially, as I say, at the diocesan level. That's where Novus Ordo Catholics and traditional Catholics have been sharing church buildings, even priests, for 40 years, since 1984, since the indult of Pope John Paul II. They've been putting this display of unity on every single day. In fact, the priest that you see on your screen right now offers both the Latin and the Novus Ordo Mass. So what you got going on here, friends, is one of the best examples of unity in the Catholic Church today. People who have radically different backgrounds, opinions, liturgical preferences, nevertheless, getting along, going to church picnics together, playing together on church softball leagues, raising funds for the air conditioners and the new roofs and everything else that's needed in the building that they share, and revering the priest who's saying both masses. These are tough times. We're in the middle of a revolution, and yet these people in these parishes have learned to try to just muddle through until times improve, right? And you know who knows that that's been going on, this unity, this unifying thing that Benedict predicted would happen? You know who knows firsthand that that in fact is the reality right now? The bishops. The bishops. They're the guys in charge. They realize it's working great. That's why they're not excited about shutting it down either. But they're being, again, ordered to by the Vatican. The Vatican that has made has made a mess of everything. Everything's just scandal-ridden mess. But you better obey us on this one. Never mind that many bishops did not obey Benedict XVI Summorum Pontificum and institute the traditional Mass in all their seminaries and their dioceses around the world. But this motu proprio, you better obey it, says the Vatican. And again, this has made things difficult on the decent bishops. The Archbishop of St. Paul, Minneapolis, for example, he could not have been more gracious to the families of the traditional Catholic communities here in our archdiocese. He actually personally conferred the sacrament of confirmation on all of our youngsters, a lot of them, about 100 of them, a couple years ago. Hundreds of traditionalists packed out his cathedral. Dozens and dozens of people were there to, take pictures and greet the bishop afterward and tell him thank you. People lining up to say thanks to the Archbishop. Again, it was just palpably obvious that there's nothing to fix. It's working pretty good considering we're in the middle of a crisis in the Catholic Church. So what are we talking about here? Why is Francis doing this to them, to the bishops, to everybody? Why? Traditionis Custodes is literally a bulldozer that just came in and started blowing things up for no reason. For no reason at all. And none of this makes any sense. Which is why, again, we here at Remnant TV, we're looking for any bishop who seems to see this and kind of winking and nodding at us going, yeah, man, there's something wrong here. In this case, we're so grateful to Bishop Daniel Felton for going out of his way yesterday in Duluth to try to undo some of the damage that's been done. He too took part in the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass with obvious respect and appreciation. You can see that Mass on your screen now. It was offered by Father Joel Hastings, who I've had the pleasure of meeting a couple of times. Fantastic diocesan priest who's gone to bat for traditional Catholics up in Duluth, Minnesota. Learned how to, say the Latin Mass, and now he's a champion of defending the right of folks of his faithful to attend it. So the bishop came in to this church with Father Hastings, and he told 300 faithful that he had appointed Father Hastings as moderator, as stipulated as necessary by the Vatican, by Traditionis Custodes. He said this priest, traditional-minded priest, Father Hastings, is the moderator. And he said the reason he had appointed him as moderator was so that the traditional Latin Mass community would know that they had an advocate, that they had a voice through their priest directly to the bishop, and that he's listening to them. Here's what he said.
One of the ways that I know that your voice will always have my ear, and that your voice is always going to be in the conversation is that I've appointed Father Hastings as the moderator of this community, so that you can be assured that in any conversation that is had moving forward, any discussion that we might have about liturgy and our Diocese of Duluth, your voice will be at the table.
He wants to listen to the traditional Catholics, then he wants to do everything he possibly can to accommodate what Pope Benedict termed the rightful liturgical aspirations of traditional Catholics.
We are fortunate within our diocese to have a vibrant community, that's you, here at St. Benedict Church, by which this ancient and noble form of the Mass can be fostered and preserved. Please join me in praying that more and more people will come to know our Lord Jesus Christ and to worship Him in spirit and in truth.
Now, y'all know I'm not a big fan of the listening church, the synod on synodality. I'm not sure what that's getting at. Most of the time it's crazy. But what Bishop Felton is essentially saying is, hey, you know what, guys? If we're a listening church, then we need to listen to everyone, including traditional Catholics.
I was very grateful that many of you came to those listening sessions, and many of you added your voice to the listening session, saying, responding to the two questions, what's hurting and need of healing, and what maybe could give me hope, that many of you talked into this experience of being able to celebrate the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist in the extraordinary form. It was so important for you to be there. And I was edified that not only did you come and have the courage to speak into that, but that you trusted that moment that you would be respected and that your opinion would be valued.
At the end of the day, friends, so many Catholics are just barely hanging on right now. Many Catholics never came back to church after they locked the churches in 2020. And now they're coming in, they're taking away the traditional Latin Mass from the few that did come back to Mass after the COVID lockdowns. Nobody knows why. What is their crime? I guess their crime is wanting to worship God at the Mass of their fathers. Is that really a crime? Doesn't seem like it, but that's what they're being told. And they have stayed on in the church despite the sex scandals, the financial scandals, the church closings, the school closings. But now, for no reason at all, they're losing their Latin Mass, and in God's name. Why, friends? This must stop. And so I'd conclude tonight by saying to any bishop out there who's still deliberating over what to do with Traditionis Custodes, it's getting pretty obvious. Stand with these people as Bishop Felton has done in Duluth, Minnesota. Stand with them. And you may discover in them those true friends of the people to which St. Pius X referred in his apostolic letter, Notre Charge Apostolique, when he said, the true friends of the people, and by extension I would add the true friends of bishops who have kept the faith, are neither revolutionaries nor innovators. They are the traditionalists. And finally, to Bishop Felton, thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you for your charity, and most of all, thank you for being a good shepherd. May God bless you always. I'm Michael Mann from Remnant TV. Thank you very much. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.